Hidden at the rear of the cave is a dedicated chamber housing the Buddha himself. He sits in the Dharmachakra mudra, the gesture of turning the wheel of the law. This reflects the Buddha's first sermon following enlightenment, when he set the teachings of Buddhism into motion. Despite its temple-like appearance, however, this remains a vihara. Cells branch from the main hall, where monks once lived and studied. Some of the most celebrated works of ancient Indian art survive here. Rather than painting directly onto bare stone, artists first prepare the walls with layers of clay, mud, organic materials, and fine plaster. Only then was the paint applied, creating the surfaces that still survive more than 15 centuries later. The most famous image in this cave is this depiction of Padmapani, the lotus bearer, a form of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, a character we have encountered repeatedly. He stands adorned with jewelry and holding a lotus flower. The image has become an icon of Indian art, celebrated for its grace, expression, and remarkable sense of humanity. On the other side of the shrine is another great bodhisattva figure, Vajrapani, associated with protection and strength. He serves as a guardian presence linked to the Buddha. Interestingly, many of the stories in this cave have a common theme: kingship. Again and again, the paintings return to rulers, princes, courts, and the responsibilities of power. Yet these are not stories celebrating authority for its own sake. Instead, they explore how power should be used, when it should be surrendered, and the moral obligations that come with it. Like much of Ajanta, work in this cave appears to have ended abruptly following the death of Harisena. In many ways, this cave stands at the very height of Ajanta's achievement and at the threshold of its decline. This next cave is just as impressive, and if not, more so than the cave we just explored. Significant traces of painting survive on the porch, entrance ceiling, and pillars, giving us a rare glimpse into how the decorative program extended beyond the interior. Many visitors notice the ceiling before anything else. The ceilings here are among the best preserved at Ajanta. Evidence suggests they were painted more than once, with later decorative schemes applied over earlier ones as artistic tastes and priorities evolved. Where the previous cave repeatedly returned to kingship, this cave places greater emphasis on woman, motherhood, family life, and the domestic world. Together, the two caves offer remarkably different perspectives on the society that created them, and provide one of the richest surviving windows into the world of late Buddhist India. Among the most important scenes is the dream of Queen Maya. According to Buddhist tradition, Maya dreamed of a white elephant entering her side. This dream foretold the birth of the Buddha. Like much of Ajanta, this cave preserves evidence of the abrupt end to the site's final flourishing. Our next cave is the largest monastery or vihara at Ajanta, and one of the largest Buddhist rock-cut monasteries ever excavated in India. Just imagine the quantity of stone that has been removed from this mountain to reveal this enormous open space. Yet, despite its immense scale, again, it was never completed. Throughout the cave, rough surfaces, unfinished details, and incomplete carving preserve evidence of interrupted work. Most of the pillars were cut to their basic shape, but the rounded details and decorative finishing found on completed pillars were never added. One of the most fascinating aspects of this cave is that the builders encountered serious problems with the rock itself. Evidence suggests that part of the cave had to be reworked as construction progressed, forcing the builders to adapt to their plans. This is a useful reminder that the builders constantly responded to the realities of the stone in front of them. To compensate, additional rock was removed from the ceiling, and parts of the floor were reworked, creating a larger interior than originally intended. As a result, even the Buddha within the shrine may have been enlarged to match the increased height of the excavation. An inscription directly associates this cave with a monk named Mathura, making him the most securely identified donor connected to the excavation. Yet, rather than celebrating himself, Mathura dedicated the merit of the cave to his parents, his grandmother, and ultimately to all living beings. It is a surprisingly personal message within one of Ajanta's grandest monuments. Despite the unfinished state of the monastery, the shrine was completed. At the rear sits a large seated Buddha, the spiritual heart of the cave. This tells us something important. Even when resources became limited and work elsewhere slowed, completing the sacred center of the monastery appears to have remained a priority. Notice that the Buddha does not occupy the shrine alone. Figures accompany him on either side. By Ajanta's later period, these were not simply decorative additions, but increasingly important parts of Buddhist devotional practice. Even in a cave where work was interrupted and many details remained unfinished, completing this wider devotional arrangement appears to have been considered important. Although the caves themselves have changed dramatically over the centuries, becoming larger, more elaborate, and increasingly focused on monumental images of the Buddha, their original purpose endured. Monks were still residing within these excavated spaces, just as they had during the site's earlier Satavahana phase, hundreds of years before.
London, UK.
This next cave is one of the most intriguing caves at Ajanta because it represents ambition that never became reality. This cave never truly managed to get underway. We can see here where two pillars have begun to take shape. It is almost as if the workmen have only recently set down their tools. Ironically, the most impressive part of this cave is not the cave itself, but the entrance. Although much of the monastery was never completed, significant effort was invested in the doorway and facade. This tells us something important about how these caves were created. Excavation did not proceed in a simple front-to-back sequence. Different groups of workers could operate simultaneously. While some cut deeper into the rock, others shaped pillars, carved decorative details, and refined completed surfaces. As a result, the cave preserves something rarely visible elsewhere at Ajanta: the process itself. As we continue along the cliff face, this next cave immediately stands apart from those we have explored so far. Above us, a second cave rises over the first. Impressive, considering this was once a solid mountain. We begin on the lower level. Right away, we find an important painting beside the shrine. Although heavily damaged, it is believed to depict the miracle of Shravasti, a story associated with the Buddha that we encountered already in a previous episode. According to Buddhist tradition, the Buddha manifested multiple forms of himself simultaneously in order to demonstrate his spiritual power and overcome the challenges of rival teachers. This cave would once have been covered in similar imagery. The smooth surfaces of the walls and pillars reveal that they were prepared for painted decoration. In many places, that decoration survives only in fragments. But the cave would have been far more colourful than it appears today. Its surface is filled with stories, teachings, and devotional imagery. Now we climb to the second level, our first time entering a cave that rises into 2 stories. This cave was excavated later, effectively an extension carved into the rock above the earlier monastery. At the top, we encounter Buddha figures carved into the walls. Many appear to belong to a later phase of activity, added after the great wave of excavation had ended. Even after the major project ceased, people continued to visit the site, leaving their own contributions behind. These are what many of the unfinished pillars elsewhere at Ajanta intended to become before work stopped. Imagine the skill required. A single mistake could ruin work that had taken months to complete and could never be repaired. Again, we find a shrine at the rear, creating another focal point for devotion. Buddhas, bodhisattvas, attendants, and protective figures occupy multiple locations throughout the cave, reflecting a religious world that had become increasingly image-centered. Earlier monasteries often focused attention upon a single primary object of worship. Here, sacred imagery surrounds us. And here we find something even more interesting: another shrine. Why stop with one shrine when another could be carved? More space for devotion, more opportunities for worship, more ways to express religious commitment within the monastery itself. Unlike some of the painted caves, this space contains modern lighting. It helps reveal details that would otherwise be difficult to see and allows us to imagine how the cave may once have appeared when illuminated by oil lamps and flickering light. And yet again, another shrine. 3 shrines within one cave. What began centuries earlier as comparatively simple monastic spaces had evolved into increasingly elaborate devotional environments. Around the edges of the hall, monastic cells continued to line the walls. Monks still lived here, studied here, meditated here. The architecture evolved, the imagery evolved, the religious world evolved, but the monastic tradition itself endured. The next two caves on this site, for anyone who saw the previous episode, will be extremely familiar. They are among the most historically important caves at Ajanta because they take us all the way back to the site's earliest phase. A tradition that spread across India during the early centuries of Buddhism, and here reaches back to the first Satavahana excavations of the site roughly 2,000 years ago. In fact, it is one of the oldest surviving caves at Ajanta. From the outside, perhaps you recognize the Gavaksha. More than just an architectural feature, it became a symbol of spiritual opening throughout Indian rock-cut architecture. Inside, the stupa remains the heart of the cave. Not a Buddha, not a shrine, a stupa, simple, restrained, designed for movement rather than direct viewing. Yet, if we look carefully, we can see that later generations did not leave the cave untouched. Bodhisattvas appear on the pillars, an evolved practice of Buddhism layered onto the structure of its deeper origin. In many ways, this cave encapsulates the entire story of Ajanta. Different generations return into the same sacred space, each leaving their mark upon it while preserving the monument at its heart. As promised, this next cave is another chaitya hall, this time larger and perhaps even older than the previous. Again, there are multiple layers here, with the stupa, the oldest form, as the central focus, and the pillars adorned with later bodhisattva paintings. This cave also occupies a special place in modern history. When Ajanta was discovered by the Western world in 1819, when a hunter stumbled across the site, this was the first cave he saw through the overgrowth. His famous inscription can still be seen today, unfortunately carved directly onto an ancient painting. This tiny shrinelet here demonstrates how intensely the area around the ancient chaitya halls continued to attract devotion during the site's last years. This cave is one of the clearest surviving examples of what an early Buddhist monastery at Ajanta originally looked like before the great Vakataka Renaissance transformed the site. Imagine this cave alongside the early chaitya halls we have already explored, and we begin to see what Ajanta would have looked like during its Satavahana phase. Not a landscape of colossal Buddhas, elaborate paintings and vast shrines, but a working monastic community centered upon worship, study, and daily life. For the Vakatakas, this cave was already ancient. This cave is an area most people brush past quickly, something far less glamorous than a shrine or a painted hall, but again, every bit as important. Water. Ajanta was not simply a collection of monuments. It was a living monastic community. Monks lived here year-round, and during the monsoon, thousands of litres of water poured down these cliffs. Rainwater could be captured, directed, and stored for later use. At first glance, this cave appears complete. The shrine dominates the rear wall. The Buddha sits at its center. The space feels finished. But it is not. The Buddha image was rushed toward completion, while work elsewhere remained unfinished. If the cave could not be perfected, then at the very least, they could finish the shrine. Imagine spending more than a decade developing a monastery, preparing it for worship, only to see the world that had made it possible collapse at the very moment it was nearly complete. Here we are, the Elephant Gate. Today, most visitors enter Ajanta the way we did. But in the past, this would have been the entrance to the site. Originally, this would have been reached from the river below. In many ways, this is Ajanta's ceremonial front door, carved during Harisena's reign. The kneeling elephants are not merely decorative. They mark the transition into sacred space. Powerful, royal, and auspicious, they appear not as conquerors, but as participants in devotion, bowing before the religious world beyond the gateway. Just inside, a cobra king, Nagaraja, seated upon his own coils, keeping watch over the whole ravine. These next two caves are among the most intriguing at Ajanta. Security is particularly strict here. The concern is not modern cameras themselves, but the cumulative damage that can be caused by bright lights and flash photography over time. As a result, filming is heavily restricted. That being said, here is a glimpse of what we have captured inside the second of these two caves. It quickly becomes obvious why this cave is so highly protected. It preserves one of the most extensive collections of narrative painting anywhere at Ajanta. Every available surface seems to contain a story. Look closely, and we find palaces, clothing, jewelry, furniture, musicians, processions, animals, and architecture. It is one of the richest visual records of life in ancient India ever preserved. This next cave is fascinating because it represents something we have not yet seen at Ajanta, or indeed anywhere in India so far. By the time this cave was excavated, the great age of chaitya halls was already centuries in the past. The Vakatakas lived among them. They inherited a landscape shaped by generations of excavators before their time. Everything we have learned so far might lead us to assume this cave belongs to the early Satavahana phase. It does not. This is a Vakataka creation, a new chaitya hall built 700 years after the first at this site. It is not layered onto an older monument, nor merely adapted from one. It was conceived from the beginning as a deliberate return to the past. Even the ribs above tell a story. Those who watched the previous episode will understand their significance, this time carved in stone rather than timber. The pillars are among the most elaborate of any chaitya hall we have seen, even when compared to Kala. In fact, with this cave positioned just above the original entrance, it is believed to have been intended to be the devotional center of the site. And yet, for all its splendor, this cave carries the same tragic story that shadows much of Ajanta. There is remarkably little evidence that it was ever used for long. Few signs of the crowds, ceremonies, and devotion for which it was created. Once again, we find a shrine-centered monastery, far more elaborate than much of the surrounding cave. It appears to have been prioritized during the final years of Ajanta's renaissance. Completion of the sacred core mattered more than completion of the architecture. If the monastery could not be perfected, the Buddha could still be installed. The Buddha does not simply occupy a shrine at the rear of the monastery, but appears to inhabit a separate space entirely. This bridge is of course modern, providing stability and accessibility for visitors not accustomed to the terrain of the ravine. Interestingly, every cave at Ajanta seems determined to justify its own place in the story. This cave is no exception. The pillars are among the most elegant at the site. They are not as flamboyant as some of the later examples, yet their proportions feel exceptionally refined. The familiar story of Ajanta returns. The Buddha image appears to have been rushed towards completion during the final years of the site's activity. Decorative programs were simplified, paintings remained unfinished. Ambitions exceeded the time available. Unlike some neighboring caves, however, there is strong evidence that this monastery was genuinely occupied. In many ways, this cave captures Ajanta at its most human form. Not merely a monument frozen in time, but a monastery that evolved, adapted, and continued to function as the world around it gradually began to change. This cave is one of the most interesting unfinished caves at Ajanta because it occupies an awkward position between ambition and abandonment. Yet although we have seen many unfinished caves throughout the site, we have not seen one quite like this. The shrine itself has been excavated. The space for the Buddha was prepared. The rear wall was smoothed and ready. Yet the image was never carved. This cave came astonishingly close to completion. This cave preserves failure, not the failure of skill, effort, or ambition, but the failure of time. Again, we find another unfinished cave, not even fully excavated. Yet this cave is particularly valuable because it allows us to see the excavation process itself. Notice how the work does not progress evenly. The cave was cut from the top down, with different teams working simultaneously in different areas. Some sections were almost complete, while others remain little more than rough stone. Even the pillars survive in an earlier stage of their creation. Large square blocks waiting to be gradually shaped into their final forms. This cave is a snapshot of Ajanta at work. We can almost see the organization behind the project. Excavators opening new spaces, sculptors refining details, different crews advancing through the mountain at the same time. Work appears to have stopped abruptly. The project was simply too large, and the death of Harisena brought the excavation to an end. This was one of the last great undertakings at Ajanta. Had it been completed, it would likely have been one of the largest monasteries on the entire site. we approach our final cave at this site, a worthy end to some of the greatest and most impressive caves in India. From the outside, we should already know what awaits us within. The cave is one of the greatest monuments at Ajanta, and in many ways the culmination of the chaitya hall tradition that began centuries earlier with sites such as Baja, Kala, Kanheri, and the Satavahana phase of this site. We have seen this form before, a Mahayana Buddhist chaitya hall, not ancient, but a later interpretation of a tradition that was already centuries old. By the time this cave was excavated, the chaitya hall belonged to the past. Yet here it returned in one of the most ambitious forms. Originally, the cave was approached from the river below by a monumental staircase. The experience would have been dramatically different from today. The walls are lined with sculptural panels, transforming what was once a simple path of circumambulation into a journey through Buddhist teaching and devotion. Along the left side of the hall lies one of the most famous sculptures in all of Indian Buddhism. The great Mahaparinirvana Buddha. Depicted reclining upon his side, this is not simply a sleeping Buddha. It represents his final passing, his release from the cycle of rebirth. Above, celestial beings remain calm. Below, human mourners grieve. The contrast is deliberate. For those still bound to the world, there is loss. For the enlightened, there is liberation. Nearby, we encounter another major sculptural panel. Mara's assault upon the Buddha before enlightenment. Together, these scenes create a remarkable pairing. The struggle before awakening and the final release at the end of a lifetime of teaching. Beginning and end, carved into the same sacred space. There is evidence that these sculptures were once painted, reminding us again that Ajanta was never intended to be a world of bare stone. The stupa remains present, but it is no longer the primary focus. The image of the Buddha now dominates the monument. A monument that remembers the earliest traditions of Buddhist architecture, while carrying some of the most ambitious sculpture ever created at Ajanta.